The silver moon hung heavy over the Iron Ridge pack, but inside the obsidian walls of the royal nursery, it was a night of pure, unadulterated chaos. The air was thick with the scent of scorched ozone and distressed musk. The twin princes, the future of the Lycan throne, were shifted into their pup forms, two balls of midnight dark fur and golden eyes, howling with a grief that threatened to shatter the very foundation of the castle. For 3 days since the queen's tragic passing, they hadn't eaten. They hadn't slept. They had only screamed, their tiny claws shredding silk tapestries and drawing blood from the most seasoned alphas who dared to approach. The king himself stood at the threshold, a mountain of a man with eyes like dying embers, his presence usually enough to silence a battlefield, yet here he was, utterly powerless against the heartbreak of his own blood. Before we enter the den of the Lycan King and witness a miracle born from the most unlikely place, I want to say a heartfelt hello to all of you beautiful souls. It's such a joy to have you back here with me today. I'm curious, where are you watching from as you join our pack? Please tell me your city or country in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. And if you haven't joined our family yet, please hit that subscribe button right now. We have so many more emotional journeys to take together, and I don't want you to miss a single heartbeat. Ready to see what happens when the lowest in the pack becomes the only one who can save the highest? Let's begin. Arya, her first name from a soaring musical drama, her last name, Bennett, from a classic tale of hidden depths, pressed her back against the cold stone of the servants' corridor. She was an Omega, the lowest rung of the Lycan hierarchy, a girl whose scent was so faint it was almost invisible to the dominant wolves of the court. To the alphas she was a shadow, to the king she didn't exist at all. She had been rejected by her own birth pack, discarded like a broken toy because she lacked the fire they prized. But as the twins' howls reached a glass-shattering crescendo, Arya felt a tug in her chest that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with a soul that recognized a kindred pain. The king, Silas, first name from a gritty western, last name Vane from a high-stakes thriller, roared in frustration, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. "Out. All of you out," he bellowed at the high-ranking healers and nannies who fled the room in terror. "If you cannot quiet my sons, you are useless to me." Silas stood alone in the center of the nursery, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his crown and his grief. He was the Lycan King, a man who could command armies, yet he was watching his lineage wither away in front of him. The twins, Leo and Luna, were circling each other in a frenzy of nipping and snarling, their tiny bodies trembling with exhaustion. Arya watched through the cracked door, her heart breaking for the little wolves. She knew what it was like to be alone in a room full of people. She knew what it was like for your own father to look at you and see nothing but a disappointment. Without thinking, without considering the death sentence that came with intruding on royal mourning, she pushed the door open. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the howling. Silas turned, his eyes glowing a dangerous, feral amber. His shadow stretched across the room, looming over the small, frail Omega in her tattered maid's uniform. "Who gave a servant permission to enter this room?" Silas's voice was a low, vibrating warning that made the very air feel heavy. "Leave. No. Before I forget you are a subject and treat you like an intruder." Arya didn't move. She didn't look at the king. She looked at the pups. She saw the way their fur was matted, the way their tiny ears were pinned back in terror. She took a step forward, her scent, sweet rain and crushed violets, wafting through the heavy, oppressive musk of the room. "They aren't angry, Your Majesty," Arya whispered, her voice a soft melody in the darkness. "They're just waiting for someone to hear them." "You dare lecture me on my sons?" Silas took a predatory step toward her, his hand twitching as if he wanted to seize her. But then something happened that stopped the king in his tracks. The twin pups, who had bitten every alpha healer who tried to touch them, suddenly stopped. They sniffed the air, their little heads tilting in unison. Slowly, cautiously, they stopped their circling and began to trot toward the Omega Maid. The first seed of mystery was planted in that moment. Why did two royal Lycans, born of the strongest alpha bloodline, react to an invisible Omega when the rest of the world failed? Arya knelt on the floor, ignoring the king's towering presence. She reached out her hands, palms up, and did the one thing no one else had thought to do. She didn't try to command them. She didn't try to heal them. She simply closed her eyes and began to hum a low, haunting lullaby, a song from the mother who had loved her before the world rejected her. The pups let out a small high-pitched whimper and to the king's utter disbelief, they crawled into Arya's lap, burying their wet noses into her apron. The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was the first breath of peace the castle had known in weeks. Silas stared down at the girl he had spent a year ignoring. Who was this Omega? And why did it feel like the heavy chains around his own heart had just loosened for the first time? The morning light bled through the tall, arched windows of the nursery, casting long shadows over the obsidian floors. Silas Vane hadn't moved from his spot by the door. He had watched, breathless and paralyzed, as the girl, Arya, spent the entire night on the floor. She hadn't shifted, hadn't complained, even when the twin pups, Leo and Luna, had used her lap as a pillow and her apron as a security blanket. For the first time in 3 days the palace was silent. But for Silas, the silence was deafening. It was a roar of questions he couldn't answer. "You're still here," Silas rumbled, his voice cracking the stillness. He stepped closer, his heavy boots muffled by the thick rugs. Arya flinched, her eyes snapping open. She looked exhausted, her pale skin almost translucent in the dawn light, but she didn't let go of the pups. "They were still dreaming, Your Majesty. I didn't want them to wake up alone." Silas looked down at her. To any other wolf, Arya Bennett was a non-entity. Omegas were the backbone of the labor force, the ones who scrubbed the blood from the warrior's armor and cooked the feasts they would never eat. But looking at her now, Silas saw a strength that wasn't measured in muscle or pheromones. He saw a girl who had been rejected by her own kind. He remembered her file now, a dull wolf from a minor northern pack. Yet she possessed a serenity that his strongest alphas lacked. "The nurses say they bit anyone who came near," Silas said, his eyes narrowing. "Why didn't they bite you?" "Maybe because I wasn't trying to take anything from them," Arya whispered, her hand gently stroking Leo's velvet ear. "Everyone else wants them to be princes. To be alphas. To be the future. I just wanted them to be warm." Silas felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang in his chest. His deepest desire had always been to protect his bloodline, but his deepest fear was that he was failing the one woman he had ever loved, his late queen. He feared his sons would grow up as jagged and cold as the mountains they ruled. He had built a life on dominance, but this girl was proving that dominance was useless against grief. The door creaked open and a woman stepped in. Elara, first name from a sweeping space opera, last name Hunt from a high-stakes spy thriller, was the head housekeeper and a dominant beta who had made Arya's life a living hell for months. She gasped, seeing the useless Omega sitting so close to the king. "Arya, what are you doing? Get away from the princes this instant." Elara hissed, reaching out to grab Arya's arm. A low, guttural growl ripped through the room. It didn't come from Silas. The two tiny pups had snapped awake, their fur bristling, their milk teeth bared at Elara. They scrambled over Arya's shoulders, shielding her with their small bodies, their golden eyes flashing with a protective rage that shocked everyone in the room. They weren't just calm, they were claimed. "Enough," Silas commanded, his voice vibrating with the power of the Alpha King. Elara froze, her face turning ashen. Silas looked at Arya, then at his sons, who were now whining softly and nuzzling Arya's neck, seeking her scent. "Elara, pack Arya's things," Silas said, his gaze never leaving the Omega. "She is no longer a maid. From this moment on she is the royal nanny. She will move into the chambers adjoining the nursery. Anyone who interferes with her duties, or treats her with anything less than the respect due to a member of my inner circle, will answer to me personally." Arya's breath caught. To the rest of the palace this was a promotion. To her it was a death trap. She knew the whispers that would follow. She knew the jealousy of the high-ranking she-wolves who had vied for this position. But most of all she saw the look in Silas's eyes. It wasn't just gratitude. It was an intense, predatory curiosity. He wanted to know what secret she held, and Arya knew that if he looked too closely he might find the one thing she had spent her whole life hiding. Why her scent was so faint and why the rejected Omega felt a pull toward the Lycan King that was starting to feel dangerously like a fated bond. I have no experience with royalty, Your Majesty," Arya stammered, her heart racing. "You have the only experience that matters," Silas replied, stepping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame. He leaned down, his scent of cedar and old magic enveloping her. "You are the only one they want. And in this kingdom, Arya, what my heirs want, they get." The week had been a blur of silken sheets and the constant demanding presence of the twin pups. Leo and Luna refused to leave Aria's side, their tiny paws constantly snagging her new linen dresses as they trailed her through the royal gardens. Silas too was a constant shadow. He watched her with an intensity that made Arya feel like she was under a microscope, his amber eyes tracking every smile she gave his sons, every song she hummed to soothe their nightmares. But the peace was shattered on the night of the blood moon. Arya was in the nursery, tucking the twins into their oversized obsidian crib, when the air suddenly turned frigid. The scent of sweet rain and violets, her own scent, was abruptly overwhelmed by something foul, the smell of wet fur and rotted meat. The balcony doors burst open with a violence that shattered the glass into 1,000 shimmering diamonds. A massive scarred wolf, a rogue, leaped into the room. This wasn't a pack member. This was a feral, a wolf who had lost its humanity to the bloodlust. Leo. Luna. Arya screamed, throwing her body over the crib as the beast lunged. The rogue let out a guttural snarl, its yellowed fangs inches from Arya's throat. But before it could strike, a blur of silver-gray fur slammed into the intruder. It was Silas. He had shifted midair, his king form nearly twice the size of the rogue. The room exploded into a symphony of snapping bone and savage growls. Arya huddled over the pups, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw Silas pin the rogue to the floor, his claws digging deep into the intruder's chest. But as the rogue died, it let out a final high-pitched yelp, a signal. Suddenly the hallways were filled with the sound of fighting. The Iron Ridge pack was under attack. Arya. Take them to the shadow path. Silas roared, shifting back into his human form, his skin glistening with sweat and the blood of his enemy. He didn't have time to clothe himself. He looked like a god of war, raw and terrifying. Julian, he shouted, summoning his captain of the guard, get her to the escape tunnels. Julian. First name from a high-octane heist movie, last name Thorne from a gritty mystery, burst into the room, his sword drawn. He was a man of few words and even fewer smiles, a warrior who lived for the king's command. Move, Omega. Julian barked, grabbing Arya's arm and pulling her toward the hidden door behind the tapestry. But as they reached the entrance to the tunnels, the first major twist struck. The secret door was already open. Standing there wasn't a rescuer but a traitor. Commander Malachi, first name from a dark fantasy, last name, Draken from a medieval epic. The king's own cousin and the man in charge of the palace perimeter stood waiting. He held a silver dagger, the blade glowing with a deadly blue light. The pups belong with the true bloodline, Silas, Malachi sneered, looking past Julian at the trembling twins in Arya's arms. Not with a king who mourns a weak queen and hides behind an Omega Maid. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. The rogues hadn't broken in, they had been let in. Silas was trapped in the nursery fighting off a wave of ferals, and Julian was now facing the man who knew every move he was about to make. Run, Arya, Julian hissed, stepping between her and the commander. Take the twins to the old forest. Do not stop. Do not look back. If I don't follow, find the high priestess. But Julian. Run. Arya didn't hesitate. She clutched the heavy, warm bodies of the pups to her chest and sprinted into the darkness of the tunnels. Behind her, she heard the clash of steel on steel and the roar of a king who had just realized his own family had turned into vipers. She was an Omega, the weakest of her kind, fleeing into a forest filled with monsters, carrying the only heirs to the throne. The inciting incident had stripped away the safety of the palace and left her with a choice: remain the rejected maid, or become the protector the Lycan bloodline never knew it needed. As she burst out of the tunnel and into the tangled, moonlight-starved woods, she felt a strange, electric hum in her blood. The pups weren't crying. They were silent, their golden eyes glowing in the dark, watching her with an unnerving intelligence. She wasn't just a nanny anymore. She was a target. And as the howls of Malachi's men began to echo through the trees, Arya realized that the secret bond the king had sensed was finally starting to wake up. Just a little further, Arya whispered, her lungs burning like she'd swallowed molten lead. Please, little ones, stay quiet. But the twins weren't just quiet, they were changing. As the moon reached its zenith, their golden eyes began to pulse with a rhythmic light. The rising tension wasn't just the hunters behind them, It was the raw, untamed power beginning to leak from the toddlers. A small spark of blue static jumped from Luna's fur to Arya's arm, stinging like a wasp. The heirs were reacting to the danger, their Lycan instincts trying to trigger a shift their bodies weren't ready for. If they shifted now, the sheer force of the transformation would tear their young hearts apart. Suddenly, a massive black wolf skidded into the clearing ahead of her, blocking the path. It was one of Malachi's elites. First name from a gritty noir, last name Sterling from a high-stakes heist film. He didn't shift back, he simply growled, the sound a physical wall of vibration that knocked Arya to her knees. "Drop the pups, Omega," a voice echoed from the trees. Malachi stepped into the moonlight, his silver dagger spinning lazily in his hand. He looked at Arya with a sneer that suggested she was less than the dirt beneath his boots. "You're a scriptwriter's mistake, a character who wandered into the wrong scene. Give them to me and I might let you run back to your scullery." Arya pulled the twins closer, her knuckles white. "They aren't trophies, Malachi. They're children." "They are weapons," Malachi countered, his eyes flashing. "Weapons you can't possibly understand." As he stepped forward, the first major obstacle arrived. The ground beneath them began to tremble. From the thicket, a second figure emerged. Not a wolf but a woman wrapped in furs and bone charms. Seraphina. First name from a gothic romance, last name Thorn from a dark mystery, the high priestess Julian had mentioned. But she didn't look like a savior. She looked like a judge. "The bloodline is screaming," Seraphina murmured, her gaze raking over Arya. "Why does the king's legacy cling to a hollow wolf? I'm all they have." Arya cried, her voice cracking. The tension escalated as Malachi signaled his wolf to spring. But Arya didn't run. She did something that made even the priestess gasp. She reached deep into that strange electric hum in her blood, the secret bond that had been dormant since her birth. She didn't have a wolf's strength, but she had an Omega's resonance. She pressed her forehead against Leo's, then Luna's, and let out a low vibrating hum that matched the frequency of their pulsing power. A wave of pure golden energy erupted from the trio, a shockwave that sent the elite wolf tumbling backward and forced Malachi to shield his eyes. It was a display of raw connection that defied every law of the Lycan hierarchy. "She is a conduit," Seraphina whispered, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror. The red herring was revealed. Arya wasn't just a nanny or a hollow wolf. She was the anchor. The twins weren't calming because she was kind. They were calming because she was the only one who could absorb the lethal overflow of their royal power. But the victory was short-lived. Malachi, recovered and twice as furious, let out a piercing whistle. From the darkness, a dozen more glowing eyes appeared. They were surrounded. "A conduit is only useful if she's alive," Malachi hissed, his face contorted. "Kill the girl. Secure the heirs." Just as the wolves lunged, a roar that shook the very stars tore through the canopy. Silas. He had followed the bond, his fur matted with the blood of the traitors he'd left behind in the palace. He crashed into the clearing like a falling star, his eyes locked on Arya. But as he stood between his rejected maid and the army of traitors, the rising tension reached its peak. Silas wasn't just there to save them, he was injured. A silver bolt was buried deep in his shoulder, the poison turning his veins a sickly black. The protector was falling, the priestess was watching, and Arya was the only one left standing between a dying king and a madman. "Look at him," Malachi sneered, stepping over a moss-covered log. "The great Lycan King felled by a single bolt of moonlight. And protected by an Omega who doesn't even have a scent of her own. It's poetic, really. The end of a dynasty, written in the dirt." "Stay back," Arya gasped, her voice trembling but her feet rooted to the spot. She placed herself directly in front of Silas's slumped body, the twins clutching her skirts, their golden eyes pulsing in a frantic, syncopated rhythm with her own heartbeat. The game-changing twist didn't come from a weapon, but from the high priestess, Seraphina Thorn. She stepped forward, her bone charms clattering like a death rattle. She wasn't looking at Malachi. She was staring at Arya's neck, where a faint silver mark began to glow beneath the skin, a mark that had been hidden by a lifetime of suppression and rejection. "Stop, Malachi," Seraphina commanded, her voice a spectral boom. "You are hunting a ghost, but you have found a goddess." "What are you babbling about, old woman?" Malachi spat. "She is no Omega," Seraphina whispered, her eyes wide with a terrifying clarity. Look at the resonance. Look at the way the royal heirs anchor their souls to hers. She isn't scentless, because she is weak. She is scentless because she is a lunar eclipse, the rarest bloodline in our history. The only wolf capable of dampening an alpha's rage and absorbing a king's power. The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow. He looked up, his vision blurred by the poison, and saw Arya not as the maid he'd ignored, but as the missing half of his own soul. A lunar eclipse was a myth, a wolf born once every 1,000 years to serve as the ultimate stabilizer for the royal line. His father had told him they were extinct, hunted to the brink because they were the only ones who could truly control a king. Arya. Silas rasped, his hand reaching out, his fingers brushing the hem of her dress. I didn't know, Arya breathed, the silver mark on her neck now burning with a blinding brilliance. My pack. They said I was broken. They said I was a defect. They were afraid of you. Seraphina cried. They suppressed your scent to hide you from the throne. Malachi's face contorted with a mix of greed and fear. If Arya was a lunar eclipse, she was the ultimate prize. With her at his side, he could control the twins' power and rule the kingdom without fear of rebellion. The stakes had just been raised to their highest point yet. Arya was no longer just a protector. She was the key to total dominion. Then she belongs to me, Malachi roared, lunging forward with his silver blade. But Arya didn't flinch. She leaned back into Silas, her hand finding the black poison veins on his shoulder. As she touched him, the midpoint revelation reached its peak. She didn't just feel his pain, she pulled it into herself. The silver poison began to flow out of Silas and into Arya's arm, the black ink-like lines racing up her pale skin. She screamed, a sound of pure raw agony that shook the trees, but she didn't let go. She was absorbing the death meant for her king. Arya, no. Silas bellowed, his strength returning as the poison left his system, but it was too late. The transfer was complete. Silas stood up, his power restored and doubled by the resonance of a lunar eclipse, but Arya collapsed. She lay in the dirt, her breath shallow, her skin graying as the silver poison began to shut down her heart. The betrayal of her own body, the weight of a myth she never asked for, and the sight of Silas looming over her in a protective fury. Everything the protagonist believed about herself had been shattered. She wasn't the rejected maid. She was the dying savior. Purpose. Push characters to their breaking point. Make the situation appear hopeless. Silas let out a sound that wasn't a roar or a growl, but a broken human sob. He gathered Arya's limp body into his massive arms, his forehead pressed against hers. The twin pups, Leo and Luna, sensed the fading life force of their anchor. They let out high-pitched, mournful keens, circling Arya's body and nudging her cold hands with their wet noses. The darkest hour had arrived, and it was colder than any winter the Iron Ridge had ever endured. Arya, stay with me, Silas growled, his voice trembling with a desperation he hadn't felt since the day his queen passed. That is an order from your king. Do you hear me? Open your eyes. But Arya's breath was a shallow rattle. The silver poison, refined by Malachi's alchemists to kill a king, was tearing through her delicate omega constitution with twice the ferocity. Her skin was marble cold, and the glowing silver mark on her neck was dimming to a dull, bruised gray. Malachi watched from the edge of the clearing, his face twisting into a mask of frantic, jagged hate. He had lost his leverage, his king was restored, and the lunar eclipse he coveted was dying before he could claim her. If I cannot have the conduit, then no one will. Malachi roared, his eyes glowing a sickly, infected yellow. He didn't shift into a wolf. He let the darkness of his betrayal warp him into something monstrous. A crone wolf, a creature of shadow and malice. He lunged not at Silas, but at the vulnerable twins who were huddled weeping against Arya's side. Silas reacted with the speed of a thunderbolt, but he was forced to make a choice that tore his soul in two. Defend his dying mate-to-be or protect his children. He threw himself in front of the pups, his claws clashing against Malachi's shadow form, but the impact sent him skidding back across the jagged rocks. Silas! Seraphina Thorne cried out, her bone charms shattering on the ground. The bond is breaking. If she dies now, the resonance will explode. It will take the heirs with her. The situation was insurmountable. Arya was slipping away. Malachi was a whirlwind of shadow and silver steel, and the twins were glowing with a volatile, unstable light that threatened to incinerate the clearing. Silas felt the crushing weight of his crown, the realization that being a king meant nothing if he couldn't protect the woman who had taught him how to love again. He looked down at Arya's pale face, her lips blue, her eyes rolled back. He was the strongest alpha in history, yet he was watching his future turn to ash in his hands. The hope that had sparked when she calmed his sons was gone, replaced by a hollow, echoing despair. "I failed you," Silas whispered, a single tear falling onto Arya's cheek. "I rejected you when you were a maid, and I couldn't save you when you were a queen." The shadow of Malachi loomed over them, his claws raised for the final strike. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the moonlight fading behind a thick shroud of clouds. In this moment, in the center of the Lycan kingdom, the light was dead and the darkness was absolute. The turning point didn't come from a sword or a spell. It came from the realization that the lunar eclipse wasn't a reservoir to be filled, but a bridge to be crossed. Arya's eyes snapped open, no longer a dull brown, but a brilliant, searing silver that pushed back the shadows of the forest. The black veins on her skin didn't just fade. They transmuted, turning into shimmering threads of starlight that flowed back into the earth. "I am not a hollow wolf," Arya whispered, her voice sounding like 1,000 chiming bells. She sat up, her movements fluid and ethereal. The twins, Leo and Luna, let out a joyous yelp and pressed their foreheads against her palms. In that instant, the three of them became a closed circuit of power. The volatile, dangerous energy that had threatened to consume the heirs was suddenly channeled through Arya, purified, and sent surging into Silas. Silas felt his heart roar to life. The exhaustion, the grief, and the lingering sting of the silver bolt vanished, replaced by a strength that felt ancient and absolute. He stood up, his human form flickering into a Lycan King so massive and radiant he looked like a god carved from the moon itself. "The bond." Seraphina Thorne gasped, falling to her knees. "It's not just a stabilization. It's a multiplication. She isn't just his anchor, she is his source." Malachi recoiled, his shadow form shrinking and hissing in the face of the lunar radiance. "No. It's impossible. An Omega cannot hold that much power." "I am an Omega because I choose to serve," Arya said, standing tall beside Silas. Her hand found his, their fingers interlacing. "But I am a lunar eclipse because I choose to love. And you, Malachi, you choose only yourself." The key to the conflict was revealed. Malachi's power was built on theft and shadows, while the bond between the king, the heirs, and the maid was built on mutual sacrifice. The twins weren't just pups anymore, they were the catalysts. By accepting Arya as their mother figure, they had unlocked the final seal on the royal bloodline. Silas looked at Arya, his amber eyes softened by a love so profound it hurt. He didn't need to bark orders anymore. He knew what she wanted. He knew what they had to do. Together. Silas asked, his voice a low, resonant hum. "Always," Arya replied. Hope sparked like a wildfire through the clearing. The hopelessness of the darkest hour was incinerated by the dawn of their united souls. As Malachi let out a final, desperate roar, Silas and Arya stepped forward as one. A king in his eclipse, ready to reclaim their kingdom and end the era of rejection forever. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't even shift. He stood as a pillar of golden light, his hand still clasped in Arya's. As the first rogue leaped, Arya didn't reach for a blade. She simply opened her palm. A ripple of silver resonance, a lunar pulse, shook the air, hitting the attackers not with force but with peace. The ferals skidded to a halt, their bloodlust suddenly drained, replaced by a confused whimpering as they looked at the Omega, who was radiating the authority of 1,000 moons. "The fight is over, Malachi," Silas's voice boomed, vibrating with the collective strength of his ancestors and the woman beside him. "Your shadows have no place in a world that has found its light." Malachi, cornered and frantic, lunged for the silver dagger dropped in the dirt. He was no longer a commander, he was a scavenger. He swung the blade in a wide, desperate arc toward Arya's throat. But the most satisfying twist wasn't Silas's intervention. It was the twins. Leo and Luna, sensing the threat to their anchor, didn't hide. They shifted. For the first time in their lives, the transition was seamless, guided by Arya's calming presence. Two small, powerful wolves, one silver gray, one midnight black, slammed into Malachi's shins, their tiny jaws locking onto his ankles with the legendary strength of the Thorn bloodline. Malachi stumbled, the silver dagger flying from his hand and burying itself harmlessly in a rotted stump. Silas moved then, a blur of golden motion. He caught Malachi by the throat, hoisting the traitor off the ground with a single hand. "You said she was a mistake," Silas growled, his eyes glowing like twin suns. "You said my sons were weapons. But look at them, Malachi. They're a family. And a family is something you will never understand." Silas didn't kill him with a strike. He did something far more permanent. He used the resonance flowing through his hand to sever Malachi's connection to the pack. It was the ultimate Lycan punishment, the great rejection. Malachi let out a shriek as his wolf spirit was forcibly silenced, his eyes turning a dull, flat gray. He fell to the dirt, a man without a pack, a wolf without a soul. The rogues in the trees vanished into the night, their master defeated and their purpose gone. The clearing, once a theater of death, was suddenly bathed in the soft, cool light of a new dawn. Seraphina Thorn stepped forward, her shattered bone charms forgotten as she looked at the tableau before her. The king, the heirs, and the Omega Maid, standing together in a circle of light that felt like it could heal the world. "The prophecy is fulfilled," the priestess whispered, bowing her head. "The king has found his eclipse. The Iron Ridge is no longer a kingdom of iron. It is a kingdom of starlight." Arya looked at Silas, her silver mark slowly fading back to a faint, glowing ember on her neck. She felt the exhaustion finally pulling at her, but as Silas pulled her into his arms, his heart beating a steady, triumphant rhythm against hers, she knew she wasn't falling. She was finally being held. "You saved us all, Arya," Silas murmured, his voice thick with a reverence he had never shown another soul. "You weren't the one we rejected. You were the one we weren't worthy of." 6 months later, the Iron Ridge Castle had shed its obsidian coldness. The heavy stone corridors were now lined with tapestries depicting not just wars, but the legend of the Silver Bond. The nursery, once a site of grief and shattered glass, was the heart of a home. Arya sat in the sun-drenched courtyard, her fingers weaving a crown of mountain lilies. She no longer wore the tattered gray of a maid. Her gown was a shimmering moon-silver silk that seemed to catch the light even in the shadows. On her neck, the mark of the lunar eclipse remained, a proud, glowing sigil that the entire kingdom now revered. Leo and Luna, now sturdy and confident young pups who shifted between human and wolf with giggling ease, were chasing a butterfly across the grass. They didn't howl in terror anymore. When they tripped or grew tired, they didn't look for an alpha to command them. They ran to Arya, burying their faces in her skirts, finding the steady, calming resonance that only she could provide. "They're getting faster," a deep, resonant voice rumbled behind her. Arya didn't have to turn to know it was Silas. She could feel his presence like a warm hearth in the middle of winter. He stepped into the light, his crown discarded on a nearby stone bench. He looked younger, the harsh lines of grief and duty softened by a joy he had once thought was a fairy tale. He sat beside her, his massive hand covering hers, his thumb tracing the gold band on her finger. "They have their mother's spirit," Silas murmured, pulling her into the crook of his arm. "And their father's stubbornness." "They have a future, Silas," Arya replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "That's all I ever wanted for them." The satisfying conclusion wasn't just in the absence of war, but in the presence of belonging. The rejected Omega was now the Lunar Queen, the heart of the Iron Ridge. Julian Thorn had been promoted to High Commander, leading a guard that prioritized protection over pure dominance. Seraphina remained the High Priestess, but her prophecies were no longer warnings of doom. They were songs of a bloodline that had finally found its balance. The secret bond that had once threatened to shake the kingdom had instead become its foundation. The maid they all rejected had done more than just calm 2 pups. She had healed a king's soul and taught a nation of warriors that true strength lies in the hands that know how to hold, not just how to hit. As the sun reached its peak, Silas turned Arya toward him, his amber eyes reflecting the woman who had rewritten his destiny. He didn't see an Omega. He didn't even see a queen. He saw the only person who had ever truly seen him. "You asked me once if I was pretending," Silas whispered, his voice a low, emotional vow. "I want you to know, Arya Bennett, there is nothing in this world more real than the way I love you." "I know," Arya breathed, her heart full of a fulfillment she had never dared to script for herself. Because for the first time in my life I don't feel invisible. I feel home. The camera of their lives panned out over the sprawling, vibrant kingdom, leaving the family of four silhouetted against the majestic peaks of the Iron Ridge. The stories of the Hollow Wolf were gone, replaced by the eternal song of the eclipse and the king. The script was finished, the victory was absolute, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the moon and the sun were finally in perfect alignment. And that brings us to the end of our Lycan epic. I hope your heart feels as full as mine after seeing Arya go from the shadows to the throne. If you loved this journey of redemption and fated bonds, please leave a comment and let me know, what was your favorite moment between Arya and the twins? And if you're ready for more emotional stories, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next adventure.